Typhoon Kalmaegi strikes Vietnam, a nation battling the rising waters. Typhoon Kalmaegi made landfall along Vietnam's central coast with immense power, unleashing relentless rain and hurricane-force winds. Within hours, calm shorelines turned into raging torrents. Streets disappeared beneath walls of water as emergency sirens echoed across coastal cities. The National Meteorological Agency declared a state of emergency as floodwaters surged at an unprecedented rate. By dawn, entire sections of Da Nang, Quang Nam Hue, and Quang Nai were submerged. Rainfall exceeded half a meter in less than 6 hours. Major rivers, including the Hoang Vu Gia and Thu Bon, rose between 4 and 8 meters, spilling over their banks and racing through markets and neighborhoods. Bridges shook under the pressure and temporary homes collapsed one after another. Vehicles drifted in strong currents as if carried by a fast-moving tide. What began as heavy rain had transformed into a nationwide crisis. In residential districts, families scrambled to higher ground as floodwater swept through doors and windows. Evacuation centers filled quickly. Authorities reported tens of thousands of people relocated from low-lying areas. Many communities became isolated overnight, cut off by washed-out roads. Witnesses described water-climbing staircases within minutes, forcing residents to the rooftops. Several people were injured while attempting to reach rescue boats through the rushing water. Throughout the day, rescue teams worked under severe conditions. The government deployed more than 15,000 soldiers, 70 helicopters, and 2,400 rescue boats. Police and military units coordinated evacuations across multiple provinces. Medical teams set up mobile clinics to treat the injured and distribute supplies. Volunteers delivered bottled water and food by inflatable rafts. The National Guard warned residents not to drive through flooded zones and to remain in designated shelters. Helicopters hovered above city rooftops, dropping emergency kits when landing was impossible. Yet the scale of destruction kept expanding. More than 1,600 kilometers of roads were damaged or completely washed away. Over 250 bridges collapsed under the force of the current. Power stations and transformers failed across multiple provinces, plunging towns into darkness. Communication lines fell silent as towers buckled in the wind. Entire districts remained without contact, their landscapes reshaped by the surge. Farmers watched fields vanish beneath muddy water. Thousands of hectares of rice and fruit crops were lost in a single night. Across the highlands, landslides blocked mountain passes and buried parts of rural communities. In the historic city of Hoi An, centuries-old structures cracked and sank under the flood. Riverside markets were torn apart, and the lantern streets once glowing with light disappeared beneath the murky tide. Boats drifted through what were once alleys, carrying families and possessions to safety. Local authorities closed tourist zones and canceled cultural festivals to focus resources on disaster relief. Relief shelters overflowed with evacuees. In many centers, families shared narrow spaces lit only by battery lamps. Food and clean water supplies were running low. Volunteers distributed rice and blankets while trying to maintain order among the growing crowds. Outside, heavy rain continued to fall, hammering rooftops and flood barriers through the night. Rescue teams feared that rising water levels could breach several shelters before dawn. The sound of rain, mixed with the roar of wind, created a continuous wall of noise across the region.
Nghe đâu. Rồi sao? Dạ.
Despite the challenges, coordination efforts remained steady. Provincial leaders held emergency meetings via radio mapping new routes for aid delivery. Dozens of transport trucks carried fuel and medical kits to isolated towns as soon as roads reopened. The government emphasized that protecting lives and restoring basic communication were the top priorities. International agencies began monitoring the situation, preparing to support with relief equipment once conditions allowed safe access. As night returned, a blanket of darkness covered the flooded provinces. The power grid remained down in many districts, leaving millions without electricity or running water. In several towns, residents signaled for help with flashlights from upper floors. Helicopters circled intermittently, their searchlights sweeping through the rain-filled sky. The storm's intensity began to weaken slightly, but rainfall persisted in steady waves. Meteorologists warned that secondary floods and landslides could occur over the next 2 to 3 days. Rivers were expected to fluctuate unpredictably as runoff from mountain regions flowed downstream. Officials urged residents to stay inside shelters and avoid crossing flooded areas until conditions stabilized. Teams of engineers inspected dams and levees to ensure structural safety. The Ministry of Agriculture issued alerts to farmers to secure livestock and machinery. Across the nation, the sense of exhaustion was palpable, yet efforts did not stop. Thousands of rescuers continued to work through the night, guided only by headlights and handheld radios. Convoys of relief vehicles waited for daylight to move deeper into the affected zones. The Central Command in Hanoi reported gradual progress in reaching the most isolated villages, though many remained inaccessible by road. Coastal guards extended patrols to retrieve stranded boats along the river mouths. By early morning, skies over the coast began to clear in patches. The storm's eye had moved inland toward the northern mountains, leaving behind widespread devastation. Officials estimated that more than 2 million people were directly affected by flooding, landslides, or power loss. Emergency shelters still housed tens of thousands who could not yet return home. Damage assessments were ongoing, but the recovery process was expected to take months. Authorities reiterated safety messages across national radio. Residents were reminded to boil water before drinking, to report any missing relatives to local offices, and to avoid touching downed power lines. Meteorological services continued to monitor the weather closely, warning that heavy rainfall might persist in neighboring provinces for the next 48 hours. Emergency hotlines and information portals were updated hourly. As the first rays of sunlight reflected on the flooded streets, the scale of the disaster became visible. Debris rooftops and overturned vehicles lined the waterlogged avenues. The nation faced the long task of rebuilding what had been lost. Yet, amid the destruction, thousands of rescuers, doctors, and volunteers stood ready for the next phase of recovery. The storm has passed, but the recovery has just begun.